This is the Listening Books Podcast, for every kind of reader, and especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and to kick off this new series, I've got not one, but two special guests. Gail Pirkis and Hazel Wood are the founding editors of the quarterly magazine and publishing house, Slightly Foxed. Because they specialise in voices that have been forgotten or overlooked, I wanted to hear which books they'd most like to revive as audiobooks and why. Welcome, and thank you both for joining me here today. The two of you, as I understand it, founded Slightly Foxed. And I wondered if you could start off just by telling me a bit about how that all began.
Yes, of course. Hazel and I worked together for probably about 7 years at an independent publisher called John Murray in London. And in 2002, the family who had run the company for over 200 years, sold out to Hodder Headline. And the style of publishing changed. And neither of us really felt that we were in tune with sort of corporate publishing. So we both left. But of course, Hazel's been a publishing and been a literary journalist for a very long time. And I'd always been an editor. So, we wanted to do something else. So together with somebody called Steph Allen, who was the publicity manager at Murray's, with the three of us, spent quite a long time talking about what we might do next. And we mooted the idea of a bookshop, a publishing house, and then had the idea for the magazine. And this was back in 2002. It was when Waterstones was selling books, 3 for the price of 2, and celebrity memoirs were the big thing. And publishing at that time was very much about the latest, the newest, the shiniest books. And I think we all felt that an awful lot of wonderful books were being overlooked. I mean, basically the backlist. So we had the idea of starting the magazine, and we wanted it to be something personal, not literary criticism, but people sharing enthusiasms for books. And we did an awful lot of sitting around the kitchen table, usually with a bottle of wine, talking about all sorts of ideas, format, title, typefaces, etc. And I got in touch with some printers in Yorkshire and got them to make us a dummy of how we envisaged it. And then I did a business plan to raise money for to fund all this. And come November 2003, we had the money in the bank, and I rang Hazel up and I said, we've got the money and we've set up the company, and we better start commissioning the first issue, which was due to come out in March 2004. Do you remember, Hazel, the sort of sudden panic when we realised that we actually had to produce something?
I do, because we'd spent a lot of time sitting around in Gail's children's old playroom, chewing all these ideas over and being confronted with the idea of an actual physical magazine that we had to produce was really quite alarming, actually. And of course, we didn't have a name initially. We couldn't think what to call it.
No, we had a very long list of possibilities.
Yes, there was a long list of possibilities.
It was a contributor, Frances Wood, she was the curator of the Chinese books at the British Library. And she's got a wonderful sense of humour and a very, very good sort of lateral thinker. And she said, why don't you call it Slightly Foxed, which is an antiquarian term for brown spots on old paper in books. But we also felt it rather reflected people's attitude of mind when they went to Waterstones and couldn't decide what to read. Basically you're Slightly Foxed. So that's what we called it, despite one investor saying, but they'll think it's about fox hunting. Every time we came back to it, it just made us laugh. So we thought, well, let's go with it.
They often ask you to repeat it, I have to say.
Yes, that's true. So we put the first issue together with contributions from, obviously having both been in publishing, and as I say, Hazel was a literary journalist, we had a lot of people we could call on to write. And in late February, the printer's van turned up at my back door with 2,500 copies of a magazine and a bottle of champagne to help us celebrate the launch. And the first week, we'd obviously, Steph had done quite a lot of publicity, and I got a call from Radio 4, the Today programme, saying it was National Book Week and they wanted to run a piece on a contrast between sort of a huge publisher and a very small publisher, so David and Goliath type thing. And would I like to go on the Today programme? And I have to admit that I'd never actually listened to the Today programme and had no idea what I was letting myself in for. But anyhow, we were featured on that, and I left my husband in charge of the phones that day, and the phone did not stop ringing all day. I mean, by the time I got home, he said, I haven't been able to go to the loo. I haven't had any lunch. It was an astonishing, first reaction from people. And, that was the beginning of it, really. And now we have 9,000 subscribers, and we go to about 80 different countries, and we do book publishing, and we've had a secondhand bookshop for a while, and we've produced mugs and bookcases and bookmarks and postcards, and it's grown, basically. I mean, it was literally the three of us and the dog when we started, and we're just about to publish issue 75. So it's been a roller coaster, hasn't it, Hazel?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the things that sort of distinguished it from the beginning was that we didn't really just want it to be the usual suspects, that you see writing in all the sort of book pages, literary journals. We sort of canvassed our friends, anybody we thought might be able to write, and as a result, it's a very sort of, it's very sort of democratic in a sense, in that, we have people writing from all kinds of different backgrounds, not just journalism and publishing and the sort of literary world, which I think perhaps, gives it's kind of perhaps very personal and kind of down-to-earth sort of flavour, which I think is what people enjoy, probably.
And we try not to be too literary. We obviously have had articles on lots of the classics, but equally, we'll have things on children's books or on, all sorts of non-fiction, recipe books, book illustrators. I mean, very sort of wide-ranging. We've had a piece on Georgette Hare, for example, because people who love reading, they like the light stuff as well as the serious stuff. So every issue has about 16 or 17 articles in it, and there might be something coming in Christmas. We've got an article on Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, but we've also got a piece on The Prisoner of Zenda and something on Shirley Hughes's children's books, and indeed an Enid Blyton for the first time, which is rather extraordinary.
I think the nice thing perhaps that does keep it sort of fresh is that, on a normal books page, you're looking for people to write about particular books, whereas people come to us and suggest books that they want to write about. So you're guaranteed from the beginning that they're going to make a good case for the book. And we don't pretend to be impartial at all. It's very personal and very partial. I'm not without judgment, but at the same time, it has a kind of a sort of fresh personal approach that I think is another thing that people enjoy. And we enjoy it too, because everything comes to us fresh. We haven't even seen it before. So that's how we operate.
I mean, you've sold it to me. I'm ready to sign up.
Well, we did have a lot of correspondence during lockdown, didn't we, Gail, saying, you've sort of saved our lives, really, during that period when everybody was absolutely shut in. I think it was a great help, actually, to a lot of people.
Yes, I think, books are an enormous consolation, aren't they? And we do feel that humour is important, that books certainly should be taken seriously, but not too reverently. They which is why, it's nice that we can have pieces on what I would call a very lightweight book, but if it's fun. And it's surprising how many people choose books that they go back to, and they're not necessarily the literary classics, but, there's something about them that they have a connection with. And we have great fun choosing the illustrations as well, where we include a lot of wood engravings, but also a lot of other images, often from the books themselves. And we commission the covers from contemporary artists. So we've had an enormous range of, including people like Quentin Blake, have done some wonderful covers for us. So yeah, it's 96 pages of joy, basically. Certainly it's joy to produce. I mean, we have a lot of fun with it, don't we, Hazel?
We do. It's pure pleasure, really. Certainly the nicest job I've ever had.
It sounds like a lot of labour and love goes into every issue.
It does, actually. And a lot of love comes back as well, doesn't it, Gail?
Yeah.
We get a tremendous amount of correspondence, from people.
Yeah.
Saying what they think about things. And
we get presents as well. We've been given marmalade and chutney and cakes and chocolate and biscuits. And we've had actually people send in donations to buy the office dog's biscuits, or one lovely lady gave us £100 one year to take, so we could have Christmas drinks.
It's just very touching, really. One feels one hardly deserves it. They're so kind and nice.
That's so lovely. Was it always the plan to eventually start publishing books as well, or did that evolve once the quarterly had met with a lot of success?
No, it wasn't.
I think it was Gail's plan, wasn't it, really, Gail? I think secretly.
Well, honestly, it wasn't. No. But at the same time, if you're a publisher, you can't help yourself.
I always thought you had it at the back of your mind.
Maybe. But our printers, who are based up in Yorkshire, are craftsman printers. So they, as well as, printing offset litho, they also are binders, and they are hand binders, which is very rare to find these days. Most binding is mechanized. So I discovered that they do hand-bound, cloth-bound books done by hand, and gold blocked on the spine, and with a head and tail band and a silk ribbon, and in a lovely little format, pocket-sized format. Hazel had the idea of reissuing memoirs because so many of them had fallen out of print, some really classic ones. So I think in 2008 we started, and the first one we did was Rosemary Sutcliffe's memoir, Blue Remembered Hills, which is about her childhood growing up in North Devon. And she'd been crippled by juvenile arthritis and was permanently disabled. And really the story is about the first 18 years of her life and how she came to write her first book, which of course was the beginning of all her wonderful historical novels for children. And we print 2,000 copies of these memoirs, and we do one each quarter at the same time as the issue comes out. So we've got a very long one. We've now done over 60 of them, and many of them would make wonderful audiobooks, but I don't think very many of them are available as audiobooks, which is a pity.
Well, you've just provided the perfect little segue to get into the meat of our conversation today. Thank you for that, Gail. I did think that given your expertise in finding the books that are maybe underappreciated now and finding a new audience for them, that it would be great to get your input on what books deserve to be brought back into the spotlight in audio form. So I've asked you both to bring a few titles to today's conversation about what you think deserves that spotlight.
We were talking about this earlier because, as I say, we've done over 60 books, so it's quite a range. But I think probably with both of us, there are three separate categories that we're particularly fond of. The first is books that are amusing, that are or downright funny, actually, and we've done quite a few of those. They're unfortunately really funny books are thin on the ground. It's much harder to write something entertaining than it is to write something that's deeply literary and serious. But the second book that we did, which definitely is laugh out loud, is called My Grandmothers and I, and it's by Diana Holman-Hunt, who was the granddaughter of the pre-Raphaelite painter Holman-Hunt. And her mother bolted and was never seen again, and her father worked abroad. So for most of her childhood, she was ferried back and forth between the Holman-Hunt widow, who lived in a very gaunt, tall, dark house in Kensington, full of pre-Raphaelite paintings, and the other grandmother, who lived in considerable comfort down in the Sussex countryside. And the grandmothers were radically different in character. The Sussex one, loved food, loved comfort, loved clothes, loved a well-run household. And the Kensington grandmother lived for art with a capital A, and she had a scullery maid who lived in the basement, who produced sort of meals out of scrag end and totally inedible food, and the kitchen was full of cockroaches. And every night when the grandmother went to bed, she set up this extraordinary sort of homemade burglar alarm at the bottom of the stairs, basically of sort of pans and chains and things that would make a terrific noise if somebody came up the stairs to steal all this art that she was sitting on. And Diana sort of captures these two women sort of pitch perfect, and they were obviously really not interested in her at all. I mean, she was a sort of an appendage, but she had a very sharp eye. And there's one instant where she goes with her grandmother, the Holman-Hunt grandmother, to St. Paul's, which I think is where Holman-Hunt is buried. And she's dressed in black, and she's got a very beaky nose and sort of iron grey hair scraped back, a commanding figure. And she proceeds to lecture the tourists who are going around the tombs by Holman-Hunt's tomb on the subject of art. And, Diana just paints a portrait of this scene, which just makes you roar with laughter, really.
Yeah, there's something about the audio format that is particularly good for humour, I think. And it takes a particular skill from the narrator as well, for whoever is voicing a book like that, to understand the humour behind it.
Yes, I agree.
And of course, delivery is such an important part of humour.
Yes.
So it really does sort of call on the skills of the narrator in a very particular way.
Yes, no, I agree. I think humour comes across terribly well. Another favourite of ours is a book called A Boy at the Hogarth Press by Richard Kennedy, who, as a young man, got himself a job, or was got a job by his influential uncle at the Hogarth Press with Virginia Woolf and Leonard. And it's a sort of, it's a bit of a cheat because he wrote it quite a long time afterwards, but it appears as a kind of diary, a day-to-day diary of this, hopeless, I think he was almost a teenager, wasn't he? Bumbling about, but, rather sharply observing what was going on. Virginia sort of agonizing in a room with a long cigarette holder, and Leonard, who, didn't suffer fools gladly. He was always trying to help, putting up a shelf which gradually descended when Leonard was talking to some rather important person, and so on. And it's just sort of gently funny. It's an amazing book, I think. And naturally, he got the sack in the end. But that's one of our favourites too, which I think would probably come across very well, as a read book.
That sounds delightful.
There's also there's that wonderful book, The Empress of Ireland by Christopher Robbins, which is an account of his friendship with an Irish filmmaker called Brian Desmond Hurst, who was a terrible old queen. In fact, the title comes from Brian in his 80s is in a pub in London, the pub to which he goes for breakfast every morning. And his breakfast basically is champagne and orange juice. And he takes in an orange, and the barman cuts it and squeezes the orange and pours in the champagne. And there are two builders in there when he comes in one day. And they're obviously muttering about the fact, he's a terrible old queen. And he turns to them with his glass in his hand and says, "I'm not a queen. I'm the Empress of Ireland." And he had a mad scheme for doing as a grand epic film on the events leading up to the birth of Jesus Christ. And he employs Christopher, who's down and out and definitely on his uppers, as a scriptwriter. And as the book evolves, they go to Morocco to check out locations, and they go and see people who might back the film. And of course, it never happens. But it is very, very entertaining. So they're the funny ones are, we are very fond of. And then we're also very fond of books which involve quite a lot of natural history and the English countryside, I suppose. There's a wonderful account by Adrian Bell called Corduroy, which is the first in a trilogy. And when he's about 20 in 1920, he doesn't want to go to university or into the city. He decides to become an apprentice to a farmer in Suffolk. And Corduroy is an account of his first year. And this is farming when it was still only partially mechanized and still mixed farms. And it's a wonderful record of, how things, the seasons, what happened when, the skills involved, the people involved, the social life in the area. And, anybody who enjoys the countryside and traditional agriculture, it's just a fantastic account.
And what sort of voice do you think would be ideal for that kind of book?
Well, an educated voice, because he went to a public school. I mean, and he actually was a poet, and he wrote novels as well. He was very, very gifted, but he had that rare combination. I suppose the other examples of people who could combine that, and Henry Williamson was one, but who had a poetic eye, but at the same time had a deep knowledge of what they were observing. It would be an interesting one to cast. Yes, I think I don't know who I'd suggest for that. And then one of Hazel's favourites, in the same vein as Flora Thompson, Lark Rise to Candleford, isn't it, Hazel?
Yes, I reread them recently, and some books you feel quite anxious about rereading again after a long time, in case they just don't have the sort of enchantment that they had the first time round. But rereading Lark Rise to Candleford and the sequels, which are called Candleford and Over to Candleford, I think, aren't they? The story of this amazing, it's sort of very lightly disguised autobiography. I expect a lot of people will know it already, but an account of growing up in this remote village and sort of educating herself in a way by going to work in the post office in the local little sort of village and near the town. And it's a picture of a whole rural society, really. And it's so beautifully written by somebody who had the most basic education. It's economical, it's poetical, it's kind of full of heart.
Another trilogy in the same vein is by a man called John Moore, who was brought up in a village outside Tewkesbury. And he wrote, first of all, Portrait of Elmbury, which is actually Tewkesbury. And this is sort of in the lead up to the First World War. And that's a minutely observed portrait of the social life of a market town. And then the sequel, Brensham Village, he moves outside Tewkesbury, and it's a portrait, I suppose, of an amalgam of villages. And by this stage, he's a prep school boy, and he's, they go bird nesting and they go fishing, and they get up very close to nature, basically. And then the third volume is called The Blue Field, and again, that's about one particular man who is a sort of wild character who has innumerable children and wives, and claims to be a descendant of Shakespeare and disregards authority, and brews a most extraordinary array of homemade wines, and it is just a sort of larger-than-life Shakespearean character. And the three of them, the three books together, map the changes that happened in the sort of English rural life from before the First World War to just after the Second World War. And you get weekenders moving in, and you get developers who, want to build housing estates, and the cinema arrives, and petrol station arrives, and gradually the old customs begin to die away, and life changes, and not necessarily for the better, it has to be said. But they're absolutely enchanting. I mean, they're timeless classics, I think, and would bear recording as audiobooks, because so many characters in them for starters. I mean, it would be such fun to do.
And what was the name of the trilogy again?
It's the Brensham trilogy by John Moore, and the first book is called Portrait of Elmbury, and then it's followed by Brensham Village and The Blue Field.
Thank you. Brilliant.
I was just going to actually mention, talking about nature and nature writing, a children's book or two children's books that we produced, Little Grey Men and Down the Bright Stream. I don't know whether you know of them, but
I don't know.
By someone who called himself BB. Can't remember what his name really was.
Dennis Pitchford Watkins.
Watkins Pitchford, is it? Or Pitchford, what? Anyway. And they're the story of the last gnomes in England. And there's nothing airy-fairy or fancy about these gnomes. They're sort of absolutely down to earth. And they're really sort of quest stories. One of them disappears and gets lost, and the others search for him down the river. And I just remember actually as a child being so enchanted by these books. They just sort of drew you in. And reading them again, they're quite marvellous, actually. And I think those, if they're not available, I do think that children actually, still enjoy, description of that kind, but also adventure as well.
Yeah. Those sound delightful. And I want to get my hands on the printed book, or books, I should say, because that sounds like I'd be charmed by them even as an adult. And I've got loads of small nephews and nieces who would enjoy them.
Yes. Yeah, well, they are charming as an adult.
When we started doing the memoirs, which are called Slightly Foxed Editions, and then about 6 or 7 years ago, we started a children's series, and they're in a much larger format, and they're called Slightly Foxed Cubs, obviously. And the first ones we did were books by a man called Ronald Welch, who wrote a series from the Crusades through to the First World War about the same family, and a member of the family appears in all the significant episodes of English history. So the first one is a crusader and meets Saladin in the Middle East. And then he comes back to England and establishes what becomes the Carey family home in Wales. And then another one features in the Wars of the Roses and the Elizabethan period, the Civil War, and all the way through to the First World War. And they're fantastic historical records, but also absolutely gripping for boys in particular, from the ages of 8 to 13. Find them completely gripping. And by the same token, Rosemary Sutcliffe's Roman and post-Roman novels, we reissued 8 of those, starting with The Eagle of the Ninth, and they are fantastic books, and we've reissued them with the original illustrations. And she manages to draw you into these characters, but also to understand what life was like and what was happening at the time. So it's a very painless history lesson, basically. But they are completely gripping, aren't they, Hazel?
They are extraordinary. I read them during one of the lockdowns, and I just lay on the sofa and read them one after the other. And it sort of reminded me of how, you tend to read as a child without lots of outside distractions. And they are brilliant, I think, because they do have an appeal for adults as well as children, those Rosemary Sutcliffe books.
Yeah,
and they're so accurate, but also imaginative at the same time.
Going back to the memoirs, I think as far as, from the perspective of listening books, what's particularly engaging with a lot of the memoirs that we have reissued is that they draw you into a different world, and they draw you very often into the mind of a child. There's a wonderful book called A Late Beginner by Priscilla Napier, which was recommended to us by Penelope Lively, and it's an account of this girl who her parents live in Egypt, and she grows up in Egypt before and during the First World War, and it is absolutely an evocation of what it's like to see the world through a child's eye. It's an incredibly good book and underrated, and really deserves to be more widely known. Even though obviously life in Egypt before the First World War is a long time ago, and you would think that one wouldn't be able to relate to it, but she has that ability to to show how a child's mind works in all sorts of different circumstances. And it's a lovely book. And we've kept it in print. When the original edition sold out, we also do plain Fox editions. So the ones that have been particularly popular, we've reissued, and it just goes on selling. And I think that would make a lovely audio book.
You know, listening to you talk about these extraordinary books, most of them anyway, I haven't encountered or heard of before. And I'm sort of deeply aware of how, even as someone who reads a lot, relatively speaking, that what I read is very much dictated by what's being promoted and talked about and what's sort of part of the zeitgeist at the moment. And I would love to be a reader who reads more books that are sort of off the beaten track that way. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for people how to seek those out that are, rather than being at the mercy of just stumbling across something randomly, are there ways to seek out books like that?
Yes, you subscribe to Slightly Fox.
Yes.
Because I mean that's what every issue. No, I mean it's true. That's our purpose. You know, every issue has 16 or 17 articles on books that have kind of slipped from the public view. They're on publishers' backlists, or sometimes they're not even in print anymore. And these are books that the people who write about them believe are still worth reading.
Mm.
I mean, I know what you're saying, because, you know, you can feel completely at sea, can't you, when you're looking for something to read? And we do, of course, I mean, we're the sort of filter in a way. We do read an awful lot of memoirs. And I suppose you could say that most of them, actually, we don't reissue. But, you know, it's just finding those rather special books that have their own voice. And I suppose particularly in relation to what you do, you know, memoirs, of course, do have their own voice if they're any good. So they're tremendously rewarding to read aloud or have read aloud, I think. You know, that particular genre, it's sort of almost ready-made, you might say, for reading aloud, because it's got its own voice and it doesn't need interpreting in a way. Well, of course it does, but you know how, as a narrator of somebody else's story, it's more complicated somehow.
Yeah.
So yes, so we do try to filter the goodies.
I'll also just plug your podcast briefly while we're at it, because I listened to a couple of episodes recently and came across authors. Well, one of them we actually had read before, the Patrick Leigh Fermor. We'd read some of his books when we were going to Greece, and those were great reads. But I also really enjoyed the Barbara Pym episode, which made me want to read her and a host of other of her contemporaries as well. But there was something that struck me in that episode that I wanted to ask you about. When it came to the part of her story where her publisher basically said, we're dropping you because the way that she wrote no longer fit into the publishing trends of the 60s. It made me wonder, do you see particular trends now that are leaving out some really worthy kinds of writing?
I think publishing at the moment is going through a bit of a revolution rather than evolution. And I think that quite recently, some very senior editors have been let go, in other words, made redundant. And there are a lot of young editors who are commissioning books from social media influencers, bloggers, and so on and so forth, who don't necessarily write well. But it's, you know, it's a fashion thing, really. And publishing always goes in fits and starts, following whatever is the latest trend. And often an awful lot of dross comes out of it, as well as some good things. And the sort of earlier stuff gets forgotten. And then what normally happens is people like us leave and set up a new publishing house to sort of go back to basics, to do, you know, and not be led by sales and marketing, but to be led by editorial quality, basically. So I think, you know, these things come and go, and everything comes around again. But I do think at the moment that, I mean, particularly on the publicity for new books, you know, the publicity machines are so efficient, and the sort of hype involved in marketing is, you know, it's often hugely overblown. I mean, I've, you know, picked up a book, you know, international bestseller, top selling, you know, best book I've ever read, etc. And you read it and you think, well, really? So, you know, I mean, there's obviously room for both. And obviously over time, the dross gets sifted out, and the good stuff eventually does survive, and at some point or other gets reissued by people like us. But it's just a sort of natural cycle, really. And tragedy for somebody like Barbara Pym, and it's, you know, not uncommon that for writers to, I mean, now writers, novelists in particular, you know, unless they've got an editor who really fights their corner, if the book doesn't sell large quantities, then they get dropped. Which particularly for a fiction writer who needs, you know, they get better usually with age, and with more experience, the more you write, the better you get at it. If you've got that innate talent, you know, it's a tragedy really that publishers won't stick with them for longer. But then, you know, economics comes into it.
Yes, as you say, the publicity machine, I think, you know, for the older writers. I've, you know, come across so many instances of older fiction writers who are writing sort of really well, but they're being published by very small publishers because they just can't satisfy the demands of the sort of big publishers' publicity requirements, really. You know, and I think, you know, the image has almost come before the work now, hasn't it?
Yes, if you're young and attractive, and, you know, you have a good cover photograph, then
yes, and a big following.
And very often the best writers are neither particularly photogenic, and they're quite shy and retiring. They're not extrovert performers, you know. I feel sorry for them when they have to sort of go on these tours and, you know, do something which is quite the opposite of what they spend most of their lives doing, which is sitting quietly writing. It's quite a dichotomy, really. But
before we close, was there another category of books that you wanted to touch up on that lent themselves well to audiobooks?
Well, I guess there's another sort of semi-category amongst things that we've reissued, and that is memoirs by writers. I mean, obviously Rosemary Sutcliffe fits that bill, but we've also reissued Graham Greene's memoir, which I think goes up to his 20s. And there's Roald Dahl's Boy and Going Solo, Gavin Maxwell's childhood memoir, The House of Elric, Hilary Mantel's memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, which is her early life. And, you know, it's interesting that these books were generally written, I suppose, after these people had become well known for other things, but the way in which they then go back to their childhoods, and, you know, you can see the seeds of their future writing careers and how they've evolved as writers. And obviously as publishers, you know, we find that fascinating, and I think a lot of readers do too.
Yes, and I was also just going to mention Jan Morris, her book, Conundrum, which I suppose you could say is sort of particular interest now somehow, when, I mean, she was one of the first people to have a sexual reassignment operation. It was a very, very brave thing to do at the time, but she's very interesting about it. You know, she says it's not about sex, it's about soul, really. And I think, you know, it's a very kind of profound look at that whole topic, which is, you know, so current now, really. And it just continues, I would have thought, to be relevant, really. So that's another one that I just sort of mention.
Wonderful.
I think diaries also go terribly well, don't they?
Yes. Well, we're reissuing the diaries of a housewife called Nella Last, who started writing a diary before the war for mass observation. And I think she kept it up for probably about 20 years. And in fact, Victoria Wood, the comedian, did a wonderful TV adaptation of the diaries in about 2006, I think. But Nella Last, she was 49. She lived up in Barrow in Furness in Lancashire. She had 2 sons and a husband who was a shop fitter. And she was basically a domestic drudge. Her husband came home and expected a hot cup of tea immediately. He wanted his, dinner exactly on time. The house kept spotless. And of course, with the advent of war, she's got tremendous energy and tremendous spirit, and she throws herself into all sorts of voluntary work, running a canteen for people, clearing up air raid damage, running a shop, raising money for the Red Cross, and so on and so forth. And it's an extraordinary record of a woman blossoming. And in fact, when the war comes to an end and all this charitable work sort of ceases, she's desolate because she's found an independence outside the home that she hadn't had before. And she now dares to say, boo to her husband and not to follow his every whim. It's a terrific diary. And my goodness, one would like to have met her. She was clearly a character. So the book is called Nella Lasts War, and it is an excellent read. I think we better stop recommending our own things there. It's quite enough.
No, they all sound like wonderful recommendations. I am aware that for people listening to this podcast because they are particular fans of audiobooks, it might have been a little bit cruel of me to settle on a topic that is specifically about books that are not yet available in audio format. So I thought, as a consolation, I would also ask you to close the show with a bonus recommendation for a book that you've enjoyed that is available as an audiobook. Hazel, would you like to start?
Well, can I jump in first with?
Sure. You
mentioned our podcast, but our podcasts are free, and you can go onto our website, which is www.foxedquarterly.com, and you can sign up for the podcast. It's completely free. We've done 42 so far. It comes in, initially it was monthly, but we've now decided to do it quarterly, and it's about an hour on all sorts of different subjects. And as I say, it's completely free. But my own recommendation, I have two recommendations actually. One is the Richmond Crompton's Just William books, which were read by Martin Jarvis, and they are an absolute joy. And he gets the different characters pitch perfect. They're very entertaining. And the other, which we actually had an article on at the beginning of the year, by Daisy Hay. She spent quite a lot of lockdown when she was out walking, listening to the audiobooks of Anthony Trollope's The Barsetshire Chronicles, which are read by the actor Sam West, all 6 books. And she absolutely loved it and wrote this fantastic article for us about it. And she's this year has gone on to listen to his recordings of Trollope's Palliser novels. And again, she's written another article for us, which is going to come out in the spring issue next year. And I haven't listened to these myself, but she says they are you get completely absorbed in this extraordinary Victorian world. And Trollope was a great storyteller. So that's my bit.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Gail. Hazel, what would you like to recommend?
Well, I'm not a listener to audiobooks as such, although I was greatly as a child. I listened to an awful lot of radio, and I don't know whether it's a cheat to mention. I mean, I adored hearing Eileen Atkins' autobiography called Will She Do, about her early life in the theatre. She's such a marvellous woman and so humorous, and talking about her early life dancing in working men's clubs, which totally ruined her feet because she was made to do tap on her toes, actually, with block ballet shoes. But the whole thing was just a joy. And I think she might have read it herself. I don't know whether your listeners, would have access to listen again or whatever, but that was absolutely wonderful. I also very much enjoyed Jan Morris's, it was called a thought diary, I think, called In My Mind's Eye. And I thought that came over terribly well. And the third one, which is only something that someone's recommended to me, was A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, which is enormously long. I mean, you could hardly hold it. So actually, listening to it would be great. So those are my sort of
ideal.
3 thoughts for what they're worth.
That's brilliant. Thank you both so much, both for your recommendations and for your good company this morning.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for having us, Jess.
And thank you for listening. I wonder, what voices would you like to hear brought back to life as audiobooks? Let us know on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. You can look for Listening Books or just follow the links in the show notes. For more from Slightly Foxed, head to foxedquarterly.com, where you'll find their magazine, books, and wonderful podcast. I'll be back next month, so now's a great time to follow or subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. The Listening Books podcast is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity that provides an audiobook lending service for over 115,000 members who find that an illness, mental health, physical or learning disability affects their ability to read the printed word or hold a book. It's simple to join. For more information, head to our website www.listening-books.org.uk.